Okay, so for making springs, we got a steel hand punch, some tin snips, vice grips, needle nose pliers, Dremel tool, some feeler gauge stock, some old springs. So I'm going to start with this .017 feeler gauge stock. I'm going to lay an old rear spring on it, kind of mark it out with a Sharpie. And I'll snip it down to size with some tin snips, and then punch some holes in the slots with the hand punch. It's a little tricky lining those up. Takes a little practice. And once the holes are punched, I could take a Dremel tool and cut out the slots. Okay, now we'll put an old front spring on the feeler gauge stock and mark it out. Punch the hole. Trim it up a little. Okay, so now we've got a front spring and a rear spring. Go ahead and load those up on the armature bar. I'll bend that front spring up a little bit, put an O-ring on there. And take some needle nose pliers and kind of roll it a little. Okay, and we'll go ahead and put that on the tattoo machine frame. And we need to give that rear spring a little bit of a bend so we can get some tension on it. And we'll lock it down and see where it's at. Didn't have enough the first time, so I bent it a little more. Locked it down. And this time it's actually got quite a bit of spring in it, a little too much. But what I noticed is the armature bar isn't laying flat on that rear coil. You can see some daylight there. So we're going to have to shim that coil. So go ahead and take that rear coil out. Get into the screw there. These are some older machines of mine. They've been sitting. So I thought I'd revamp them a little, maybe put them to use again. So I'm just using that same feeler gauge stock. I just punched a hole in the corner, and then I'll snip around it. Just making a little shim. That hole is for the coil screw to go through. There we go. I'll put that underneath the coil, put the screw back in. Put the machine all back together and check it, and there we go. Now we're good. The armature bar is laying flush against both coils. So now go ahead and start trying to get things just lined up. I'm going to set this machine up as a shader, probably like a cutback shader. I want to run fast, have a small stroke. So I'm just kind of getting an initial adjustment, get it kind of close to what I think it should be at. I've got that binding post back a little further to give it more of a cutback. I'm adjusting the contact screw to make sure there's not a whole lot of a gap between that front spring. And then I'm going to go ahead and just fire it up. And if your machine ever does this, there's probably a wire touching the frame somewhere. Sure enough, I've got a wire that got buried underneath the coils. I went ahead and popped it out, and we're back in business. So what I noticed was there was a blue spark coming from the contact screw in the front spring. Blue spark usually means you've got a bad capacitor. The way we can test this is to take a capacitor, touch it to your rear post and your top post, and if the blue spark goes away, then you've solved your problem. As you can see here, I think you can see that little blue spark. It goes away when I touch it with the new capacitor. And on further inspection, I found that the capacitor on the machine was disconnected. So I went ahead and stripped the end of it. I'm going to put a little bit of flux on the end of the wire and the point where it needs to be soldered to on that rear post. I get a little bit of solder on the soldering iron, and I'm just going to try and get that. There's already solder on there on that contact point, so I'm just going to get it hot while keeping that wire pressed against it. And once that solder liquefies, there it goes. You just hold it there for a couple seconds till it solidifies, and should be back in business.
Hey, Jim? Yeah, I got up and I was walking towards the hallway.
Check it out, make sure there's no blue spark.
Telling me something, but I couldn't hear.
Alright, so now we'll start getting the machine set up. What I'm doing when I'm pushing the armature bar down to check the gap between the front spring and the contact screw. And I'm also looking at the gap between the armature bar and the top of the first coil. And here I'm running the machine and then turning the power supply up and down, and I'm checking to see if the stroke is changing. If it stays the same, that's what I want. If it's changing, it means I might have too much tension on the rear spring. And my main concern is that the gap seemed a little shallow. Actually, the stroke seemed a little shallow. I felt like I needed a little bit more stroke. So I'm moving the binding post forward a little bit more so that I can get a little bit longer stroke. And again, I just keep checking the gap. I don't want too big a gap. I'm going to dial in the contact screw. I'm putting my finger underneath the armature bar as it's running to see if the armature bar is going to stop, and also get an idea of how hard it's hitting. It was actually hitting really soft. Again, I'm checking the stroke, make sure the tension on that rear spring's good. I'm just slowly getting this machine dialed in. Still not quite right. I'm going to kind of vary the angle on the top post a little bit to see if that makes any difference. And then I just want to make sure everything's locked down. So I'll give that, lock that down. Then give it one more push, get that contact screw lined up with that front spring. And there it is.